recognizing what burnout is not is essential for understanding its nature and for you, like how you can relate to what you're experiencing. So burnout was first recognized in 1974 as a psychological diagnosis by Herbert Freudenberger, and he defined it as a physical or mental collapse caused by overwork or stress. And later, the World Health Organization defined burnout to be occupational phenomenon and suggests that it should not be applied to experiences in any other areas of life. Now, according to World Health Organization, it's a psychological and physical condition resulting from chronic workplace stress that's not been managed. However, I would agree with that statement if it wasn't isolated to the workplace. So I really believe that it's a psychological and physical condition resulting from chronic stress that has not been successfully managed. Because if it was true that it was only in the workplace, how do we explain the burnout of people outside of the workplace, right? Based on my experience, and I would really argue that it's not isolated to work only. I've worked with burned out people who do not have jobs, right? So for the sake of modern day well-being, I would urge us to open our minds and consider that anyone can experience burnout regardless of their profession. And there are many, many different types of burnout. But today I want to share with you 4 types of burnout to be aware of that tend to be the most dominant that we see in this day and age. The first one being emotional burnout. This is the exhaustion, the frustration, this feeling of being drained all of the time. It is you maybe struggling to regulate and manage your emotions, maybe heightened mood swings, reduced ability to actually cope with stress that you were once able to cope with, and that nature of being more cynical and detached, like I mentioned earlier, and maybe a bit more pessimistic about life. Now, emotional burnout can be strongly associated with crisis burnout, which is when something intense is happening in your life and the knock-on effect of that crisis continues. It is also associated with discriminatory burnout. So anybody that experiences racism or any other kind of discrimination, that over a period of time can start to burn us out as well, particularly from an emotion standpoint. It is also heavily linked to relational burnout. If there are certain people in your life, in your world, in your workplace that are there for a prolonged period of time and there are these constant challenges, sometimes relational burnout can be a thing as well. So those are always come under the umbrella of emotional burnout as well. Now, the second dominant type of burnout we see is physical, right? Like I said earlier, all of these are intertwined, but physical burnout is associated to the chronic stress that happens inside the body, right? So this is the fatigue, the headaches, the tension, the sleep disruption, the changes in appetite. This is the psychosomatic symptoms that can start to show up. This is your immune system being weaker. This is you getting sick more frequently. This is you starting to perhaps notice changes externally on your body, or even the way that you're feeling when it comes to your energy levels as well. These are all physical symptoms, obviously, of physical burnout. Work-related burnout, I would say, is definitely up there within the top 4. So work-related burnout, and these obviously are linked to demands of stresses in the workplace. So overwhelmed by the workload, perhaps a loss of control in the workplace or lack of autonomy in your tasks, and not being able to actually think and behave and do what it is that you feel like you want and can bring to the table. There can be a perceived lack of support from colleagues or from bosses as well. So this type of burnout obviously is from that prolonged exposure to chronic work-related stresses as well. And that does include things like remote work as well. This can also be associated with academic burnout, so people that are studying, right? Students potentially there. Volunteer burnout or activism burnout. Okay, this is also a form of work-related burnout. Entrepreneurial burnout as well, and then we have specific industry types of burnout as well, like technology, sales, teaching, creatives, the arts, social work, parental burnout even. These would all come under the work-related burnout as well. So as I'm sharing these, I want you to again just pause and reflect in your journal and perhaps consider, do you need to go and explore some of these specific types of burnouts, because they do have their own nuances, and some of those nuances can lead to a slightly different recovery strategy for you as well. But the fourth one The fourth most dominant burnout that we're seeing more and more of right now is digital burnout. And this is that constant connectivity, right? Always being connected to devices like your smartphone, your laptop, social media, right? All of these different things. And it's making it a lot harder to just disengage and have some processing time for ourselves. Related to this is information overload, right? So exposure to these constant streams of information, notifications, it's enough to overwhelm anyone, right? Unless we are taking control of it. So there's so much information to process that sometimes it's just too much for our cognitive brain, right? So it gets exhausted and then we can't actually focus. I would say social media comes under that digital burnout massively. This excessive use of social media and scrolling. Not only can the act of that and being in close proximity to screens all the time could obviously affect us physically, but the psychology of comparing ourselves to others, dealing with online conflicts, different sort of pressures to be able to maintain this curated life, right? Living your best life on social media and things like this, that all contributes to this emotional exhaustion. Workload is a big part of it as well, right? It's a lot of the time we're not only perhaps scrolling on things like social media or on our devices, consuming more and more information, even if you read the newspaper on your phone or on your device, we're also having a workload from work, right? For those people that are working. Now, this is becoming more and more apparent in the workplace because there's obviously more and more emails coming through, virtual meetings coming through, and we've seen obviously an increase in that since the pandemic, and this constant flow of digital communication, which is making it a lot harder for us to have boundaries. Everything else has become very efficient, right? But our attention span hasn't, right? If anything, our attention span has got worse. Digital burnout can also include things like gaming, right? Sometimes one of those escapism behaviors to avoid how we're feeling can sometimes be to play games, playing games on your phone, right? I remember going on a silent retreat. It was the first silent retreat I'd done. And so they take away your phone and everything else. And we all got our phones back on the very last day when we was about to leave, and this lady, she got her phone and she just immediately started playing Candy Crush, and I was just so confused. I'm like, you've just had 10 days in peace, in quiet, you've been disconnected from family and friends and conversing with human beings, and your first go-to was to go play Candy Crush. Like it just doesn't make any sense in my mind. However, there'll be something going on with her that is really got this strong yearning for the game, right? And so it's really important for us to recognize where our focus is going, because even like learning now, that plays a massive role in our digital burnout if this is what we're experiencing, right? Because if you're studying something, often now reading something is all on a device of some sort. Okay. And then on top of that, I'm definitely guilty of this, is multitasking, right? So you've probably got a certain number of tabs open, you're working on one thing over here, and then you're doing something over there, and then you get notification over here. And it's very easy, if we're not careful, to miss certain things, right? And also to miss that, again, processing time and this ability to be able to focus ourselves as well. So just take a moment and ask yourself if any of those sound familiar to you, and make a note in your journal. And if so, I know you're going to want to know what to do about it, right? It's really important to know where you are to know how to move forward next. We didn't just wake up one day and we were burned out. It happened gradually over time. And this build up is a bit like being on a roller coaster. And there are 6 stages on this roller coaster that lead to burnout. So the first stage is what we call autopilot. Believe it or not, you've actually been on this kind of roller coaster since the day you were born, right? You have this inbuilt guidance system so that we can remain safe and protected at all times, right? It's our primal survival mechanism. And we need to make sure that we are living on autopilot so that we are naturally absorbing stress, letting it go, absorbing stress, letting it go, right? So therefore we have these repetitive patterns on a daily basis, like physical, mentally, and emotionally. So, for example, we'll get like physically tired or hungry, and then we eat or we go to sleep, right? Very, very natural. But what tends to happen is if we don't pay attention to what's happening on autopilot, if we don't assess what's happening on autopilot, we go into stage 2, which is the onset of stress. right? Now, this can be that we've not paid attention to some of our kind of daily needs, or it can be that something tragic happens in someone's life, right? So loss of a loved one, being in an accident, losing a job, having difficulties at work, starting a new job, entering new relationships, or health challenges, moving house. All of these different things can create this trigger, right? This onset of stress that we might start to experience. And you'll know when you experience these because it's when our muscles tense up, or it's when we feel our heart rate increasing, or we feel a bit more irritable or tired, or we have trouble sleeping. And we all have times like that. But what happens when we have that onset of stress? We then need to learn how to navigate it, which is stage 3, right? So navigation is when we actually take control of our stress response, right? It's when we decide how we're going to respond to this stress. Are we going to notice that we're having trouble sleeping and do something about that? Or are we going to recognize that our heart's beating extra fast, or we're making poor decisions, and do something constructive about it? This is where the navigation phase is really, really important, right? Because after the initial shock of a stressful event, we want to kind of come down, and this is our opportunity. This is our window to actually start to create change, okay? But this is sometimes where people start to go wrong, right? They start to adopt unhealthy coping mechanisms to that stress instead of healthy ones. So they might start to ignore the signs and symptoms of stress, right? They might start to pretend that everything's okay. They might start distracting themselves from how they feel. They might start to use substances, right, to distract themselves from what they're experiencing. They might lash out at loved ones, right, as their form of expression of how they're feeling. They might actually start to withdraw from others, like we mentioned earlier. They might start to drop their expectations of themselves, right, and start believing that it's normal to suffer. These are all unhealthy ways of navigating stress, which unfortunately then leads our internal system to stage 4, which is what we call poor adaptation. So this is when we've had the stressful event, we have then not responded to it in the most healthy way, right? So we're still on the roller coaster because we didn't get off it earlier, right, in that navigation stage. And that was when we had the opportunity to. But now our system is adapting poorly. Now our system is noticing things that have been going on a little bit longer, right? So maybe now we've got difficulty sleeping every night instead of some nights. Maybe our confidence is at an all-time low. Maybe the fast heart rate is now turned into panic attacks. Maybe some bad days have turned into some chronic overthinking or negative thinking, right? This would show that we are at kind of that stage 4, right? We've adapted now to this way of being. And then internally inside of our body, it brings us to stage 5, which is what we would call our tipping point, right? And this is what we get to when enough is enough, right? It's when we continue to neglect all of those things already mentioned, right? And we choose not to process it, all of this stress starts to stack up and compounds, right? And then we repeat the stages of the kind of the roller coaster that I've already described over and over again. Then we get more stress, right? And then we get more, we challenge to navigate that stress in a healthy way. We don't do that. So now we adapt poorly again, right? And we just continue adding it up, adding it up. And as we do that, we start to have more like emotional outbursts, or we call them like stress explosions. We start to question everything. This is when we're going to start to experience chronic pain, snapping at loved ones more severely than perhaps what we did before, right? Maybe this is where you start to have impulsive decision making as well. Maybe relationships start to suffer. Ultimately, you feel like you're drowning at this stage, right? You're at this tipping point, and often this is where an onset of depression or helplessness can start to show up, right? But our tipping point is another opportunity for us to actually process before we burn out, right? And stage 6 is the burnout. It is what we've been talking about, commonly described as rock bottom, like I described earlier. This is when our mind, body, and heart is completely depleted, right? And sometimes the resources are a little bit harder. So just know that this is a very natural journey, right? It's so natural to be on this roller coaster and go from ticking away autopilot, like, you know, just almost like ignorance is bliss to some extent, and just getting on with life. And then we have something stressful happen, right? And then we have this opportunity to navigate and go one way or another, right? But the roller coaster perhaps takes us into poor navigation, right? And unhealthy coping mechanisms. So we dip a little bit and then we try to adapt, but we can't want, and now we're pushing uphill, we're pushing up on this roller coaster, and it's not as effective as what it could be. And now we're feeling like we're almost like running at half our capacity. And at that point, we then hit a tipping point, and then boom, down we go on that roller coaster into burnout. So the reason for sharing all of that with you is because it's very, very common. This journey, this roller coaster is so, so common. And the good news is that if we're aware of this journey and this roller coaster, then we know how to get off of it, right? So ideally, we get off the roller coaster early, right? As soon as that onset of stress occurs and we're in that navigation phase, ideally we get off of the roller coaster. But unfortunately, many of us don't. I am thinking, like I said, of doing a separate episode for each of the 6 core issues that are underpinning burnout, like I mentioned, and more specific episodes on the different types of burnout also. So let me know what you want, and I'll make sure these episodes are created especially for you. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, please be well.
If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode.
Then share it with a friend who you think might benefit.
Spread the word. That's how we're going to impact the world, by helping each other.
We appreciate you so much, and as always, unconditional love and wellness to you.